homelessness and hope. In today's special episode, we are talking with Rene Denfeld, the award-winning author, speaker, and justice worker, and also a keynote speaker at our 2023 Paving the Way to Educational Success conference. Rene is the author of acclaimed novels The Child Finder, The Enchanted, The Butterfly Girl, and the forthcoming Sleeping Giants. Her literary thrillers explore themes of survival, resiliency, and redemption. Rene was the chief investigator at a public defender's office and has worked on hundreds of cases, including death row exonerations and helping rape trafficking victims. In addition to her work, Rene has been a foster adoptive parent for more than 25 years. It was so cool to speak with Rene right after she delivered our keynote address at our 2023 conference near Pittsburgh, and we talk about her novels and what inspired her work, and importantly, how to nurture healing in the midst of trauma. So with that, let's hear from Rene Denfeld, author of The Butterfly Girl. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Well, hi, and welcome to our podcast. I Will Be Your Voice, Stories of Homelessness and Hope. We are live at the 2023 Paving the Way to Educational Success conference here near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I have the pleasure of having a podcast today with our keynote speaker, Rene Denfeld, who is the author of The Butterfly Girl, among many other things, which we are going to talk a little bit more about today. So I want to welcome Rene to our podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And so, is this your first time in Pittsburgh?
I was here years ago, but honestly, I don't really remember it. So,
okay.
Yeah, I was excited at the idea of coming out here.
So you traveled from where?
Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are some similarities or differences that you've noticed in just your one day?
One day, yeah. The fall colors.
Yeah.
It's actually my favorite time of the year, and we're just really getting into the fall colors in Oregon. Okay. Same here. Yeah, there's also a very similar kind of rural working class kind of vibe. Portland, Oregon doesn't have that as much anymore, but when I was growing up, it was a very kind of sleepy blue collar town. So, with a lot of farms and rural stuff on the outskirts. So, yeah, it's beautiful here.
Yeah, we're just starting to get fall color, so it's just mid-October, and favorite time of year for me.
Gorgeous.
So we are just coming out of your keynote address at the Paving the Way conference, but we wanted to tell our listeners of the podcast who couldn't make it, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and about the novels that you've written, and we'd love to hear about it.
Sure. So I came in to talk about primarily about one of my novels called The Butterfly Girl, which centers on a young girl named Celia who is homeless and living on the streets of Portland, Oregon. The novel is very much inspired by my own life experiences as I was homeless as a young teenager. That was some years ago. And things are different now, but there's always, similarities in the struggle. Like a lot of the children you help, I come from a background with a lot of poverty and trauma. And today, in addition to other jobs, I am also a longtime foster and adoptive parent. So much of my life's work, my creativity, the stories I tell, as well as my actual day jobs, are centered around issues such as homelessness and children in foster care. So I came in today to talk about the book and how it was inspired by my own experiences, as well as to share some of the things I've learned from my own history, as well as my own work and experiences as a parent about trauma and how we look at it and how we can help children that have experienced.
Yeah. So when did you begin to start writing? What inspired you to write stories and get into being an author? And when did you start?
Well, as a little girl, I loved books. I've been a voracious reader since the time I was little, and it was always kind of my escape and my sanctuary. And I just kind of entered into the world of books. And in so many ways, stories saved my life. because I just built an elaborate fantasy world. And when my life was very traumatic, as it often was, I would escape into this fantasy world. But I also found just a lot of hope in stories and hope in books. And by reading, I remember as a child reading books and realizing people had different lives than mine. Kind of realizing there's this whole world out there that I could be part of. My life doesn't have to end up like the people I see and know on a personal level every day. So I spent a lot of time as a child reading, and I always dreamed of being a writer. But I really felt like people from my background couldn't become writers. I had this idea that you had to have fancy degrees and have a certain kind of background, which I think is a very common kind of myth that's out there. Nowadays, you meet a lot of people who think you have to have an MFA, for instance, to be a writer. And I think if you can afford it and it's a possibility for you and you want to do it, then by all means, kind of go for it. But I think it's also very much the case that we need to have more writers and voices from marginalized backgrounds. And a lot of people from marginalized backgrounds don't have the degrees. And I think our voices count too. And our voices and stories need to be told. So long story short, I'd always wanted to be a writer. After I got off the streets and after I'd been homeless, actually, I got off the streets, I got a work permit. And when I was 15, I was able to get a job at a McDonald's and was able to get a little studio apartment. One of the differences between then and now is at that time housing was much cheaper. But one of the first things I did is I went and bought this kind of busted up old black typewriter from a thrift store. And I'll never forget, it had a missing R key. So when you try to, type something in this typewriter, the R didn't work, and I'd have to go and fill in the letter.
Okay.
But I would actually write poems, and I would leave them around bus stops and places on the streets for my old street friends. But it took me many years after that. I always wrote. I wrote a lot. I wrote a lot of poems and short stories, but it took me literally decades to feel like I had the right to show them to other people, that other people might actually want to hear my stories. And so I didn't actually end up publishing my first novel until I was in my 40s. It took that long to kind of heal the trauma that I'd experienced and get to the place where I felt like I could kind of put myself out there in the world and say, here's the story I wrote.
Yeah.
And the miracle was that novel was sold and published and won a bunch of very fancy awards. And wow, it was just an amazing experience for me, from coming from where I did to have that happen.
Yeah. The Butterfly Girl was your first book?
The Enchanted
was your first book.
The Enchanted was actually my first.
Okay.
And then I wrote the Child Finder, which was a big hit. And then The Butterfly Girl was the third novel.
Okay. You actually shared earlier today about imagination, and that imagination is a really powerful coping mechanism. And so hearing you speak about your journey from being inspired to write and how it was so important, it's interesting to hear that perspective. And did you want to say anything else about your message today about imagination being so important for these students?
Yeah, sure. It's very, it's a very special topic, for me. I talked today about how I think we talk a lot about resiliency in our culture. I'm not always sure what that's supposed to mean.
Yeah.
And for me, imagination is the true resiliency. Because when a child has an imagination, they can imagine anything. They can imagine a different future for themselves. They can imagine, what would it be like if I went to college? Or what would my life be like if I wasn't a foster kid? What would my life be like if I wasn't homeless? And so when you're able to imagine these things, I think this kind of real miracle starts to happen. Is that in our brains, actually, when we imagine something, it becomes real. It becomes, in a sense, it can be part of what we feel is our destiny. And so as a child, I would imagine a lot of things, and a lot of them were very fantasy-oriented, but they also kind of filled me with this sense of hope and determination, because, if in my fantasy imagination I was a warrior, for instance, it would fill me with this sense of, power.
Yeah.
And so when we encourage imagination in children, we give them kind of this access to all these tools. We give them access to these emotions and feelings. And we also, I think, give them a right, in a sense. They start feeling like, I have a right to exist. If I imagine a different future, then one thing that naturally happens is, say you imagine, I can imagine myself going to college. You start making those steps that are necessary. You can imagine the steps.
Yeah.
So I think imagination is this kind of powerful and often overlooked tool. And when you give a child that, you are basically equipping them to figure out their own destiny, and you're equipping them to create a future for themselves, and nobody can take that away from them. Once you have an imagination, it's, like riding the proverbial bike. It doesn't go away. You always know how to use it.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, and you sort of alluded to this, but you spoke about how your novels were inspired by your life experiences. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason why you decided to keep those topics in your books and not write about something completely different? Was it hard for you to kind of relive some of those experiences because they're in your writing? Mm-hmm. So if you can share anything about that.
That's I think you've touched upon something very important, because I think, and it goes with the imagination piece, I find writing to be very therapeutic and healing. And I think it's very helpful for survivors to write. When I'm working with, children from foster care or people that are homeless or anybody with a very traumatized background, I really do encourage them to write. And you will hear that about journaling, for instance. But actually, I think creative writing can be very healing. And it's something that it can be another kind of tool in our toolkit. Because in writing things through the lens of fiction, you can take something that's actually happened to you, or it could be something you're afraid of happening to you, or any of your, these experiences you've had. But when you're writing fiction, you can change the outcome. And I kind of feel that often by writing my novels, I'm changing the outcome of some stories. For instance, my first novel, The Enchanted, part of that was very transformative and healing for me, and that is it's actually narrated by a person on death row. And for many years, that's been my day work. I work for the public defenders, and I work with people in prison, which is also very healing. It's healing to help others. I think it's when we help others, we're changing their story for the better, and we show up kind of as the adult that we needed to have in our lives. We may not have had that adult, but now we can show up as that adult. And so when I wrote that story, I was able to, the outcome, I could change the ending. And so when you're writing creatively, you can write about things that were very sorrowful or very hurtful for you. And I think this works kind of across the board. Like, say somebody's going through a bad divorce. Through creative writing, you can change the story. And maybe part of what you're doing is giving healing and redemption to the person in this story that's experiencing the divorce. So I think that's why I chose fiction instead of memoir, because I get to choose the ending. And also I like fiction. I find fiction is a way for us to learn about each other that's very gentle. People love to read novels, they like to read fiction, so through a novel they can learn about an issue like youth homelessness, or people on death row, or kids in foster care. They can learn about it in a way that's interesting to them, and a kind of a gentle introduction.
Yeah. That's really insightful. Mm-hmm. I was wondering about, you shared that you're a foster adoptive parent, and nationally we have a lot of children, youth in foster care. I think it's over 400,000, and the number of foster parents that are licensed is much, 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 much lower than that. It's something, I think, in the 200,000 range. So why was that important to you to be a foster parent and go on that journey?
When I was in my 20s, I decided I knew I wanted to have kids. But I'll be honest, the idea of a pregnancy never had any appeal to me. Okay. It sounded horribly painful.
Same.
I know.
I don't have that option, of course.
But if you did, would you want to do it?
Probably not.
Yeah. And it felt like, gosh, that just sounds painful. And I knew from my background, I knew there were a lot of children in foster care. And I knew that their trauma histories wouldn't frighten me. So to me, it was kind of funny because I was in my early 20s, actually, when I decided this. And it made perfect sense to me. I thought there's children that need homes, and I want to be a mom. How more perfect could this be? And I do remember telling some of my friends who had more privileged backgrounds about this, and I'll never forget the horror and sometimes consternation that people responded. I mean, there were a lot of people that responded like, "Oh my gosh, you shouldn't do that," or, "Are you sure you want to do that?" And I kind of ran smack dab into all these cultural biases about kids from foster care, and which didn't stop me, of course. And I think part of it was, it's really important not to have like some sort of savior model. I don't think that really motivated me. But I thought, I'm not fazed by the histories these kids have. And maybe by adopting foster care, there was also a part of me that was telling myself, you deserved a better childhood too. We all do. And the big surprise of the journey was, I talked about this today, was realizing I was giving myself the childhood that I never had. So, and it wasn't something I was expecting, but by giving my children these love-filled, safe, solid, stable lives with plenty of therapy and giving them the help they needed and the love they needed, I ended up kind of giving it to myself. And that was like a really kind of wonderful full circle moment to me.
That's something one of our speakers and we talk about is that these students, they're not bad kids. They need support to heal.
Yeah.
And so that was, that's something that's always stuck with me that I keep in mind.
Yeah. Unfortunately, societally we have I think there's a lot of racism and classism that kind of goes into the stigmas about children from foster care.
Yeah.
But the truth is we live in a very traumatizing society, and a lot of us are traumatized.
Yeah.
And giving people help shouldn't be that hard. It's actually not. If the systems are in place, it's not that hard to give people help.
Yeah. It's about connection and relationships. And we talk about, the power of ordinary moments. And, it could just be that moment that helps influence, the future for kids. So
yeah. I think that's one thing that's really resonates with me, because when I was a little kid, there were moments where a teacher would do something who would, encourage my writing, or some little moments, ordinary people, ordinary teachers, and they didn't know that those little tiny moments had a profound impact on me and would kind of carry me forward. And I can look back now and think, that teacher saved my life, when I was in 8th grade or whatever, and they never knew that, but I think we have just a really profound ability to impact each other in just very small ways that aren't actually that small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to wrap up by asking you a little bit about your next book, which we talked about between us about Sleeping Giants. But can you tell us a little bit more about what we can expect from your next novel?
Sure. So my next novel is called Sleeping Giants. It comes out in March, spring, from HarperCollins. I'm very excited about it. It's a little bit of a departure. It's not a story that's related to the other books I've written. But interestingly enough for your listeners, it's partially set in a youth center, a child center on the Oregon coast, kind of a glorified group home. Basically, we still have orphanages in this country. We just call them by different names. And there's a young boy named Dennis who lives in this place, who ends up going missing, which is part of it's a mystery and a thriller, literary mystery and literary thriller, I guess I would call it. But it's very much a story about how far we will go to find a sense of family. And I think that's something a lot of us relate to not just, children from foster care or those of us from traumatized families that end up homeless. But, we all so desperately want to feel like we belong somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's what Sleeping Giants is about. It's also about something else that I've learned a lot in my justice work and in my life, and that's about how much harm is committed by people who think they're doing the right thing. And I really wanted to explore that because I think, a lot of times we kind of when we're talking about bad things that happen in a society, we kind of want to turn the perpetrators into the other. But a lot of harm in our society is committed by people who at the time think they're doing the right thing. And how much we can learn by slowing down and asking the questions and being thoughtful.
Yeah.
And not rushing into cures or rushing into answers, which applies not just to children in foster care, but a lot of things politically and globally.
Yeah. Well, I really want to thank you for having this dialogue and conversation with me today, and also for coming to Pennsylvania for the conference here. What is something you're looking forward to in 2020, the rest of 2023 and into 2024?
Oh my gosh.
I guess your new book.
My new book is one of them. But actually, I have a new grandbaby. My first grandbaby was born a couple months ago, my oldest son. And my kids are all doing amazing. I'm just so proud of them. I have to admit, I'm loving the grandma thing. So I'm looking forward to more of the grandparenting. I'm kind of a simple person. I like the homebody stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. You guys are all doing just great work. And for the people that are listening, I just want to thank them too for all those little moments that they're giving children. That, you're not going to ever see the outcome, but it's there and it means something and it matters. So thank you.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you.
So with that, we are closing this episode of I Will Be Your Voice, Stories of Homelessness and Hope. Thank you for listening, and tune back again for our next episode.